Now, how will governments around the world cope with their ballooning deficits on their road to recovery? Our next guest says that the key lies in private behavior. Martin Wolf is chief economic commentator at the Financial Times. He's written about this in his recent column. And Martin, I know that you looked at the surplus and deficits of the private sector and the governments. What kind of themes did you identify?
Well, the point I'm making is that we really can't understand what's happened to budgets around the world, and particularly in the developed countries, if we don't understand what happened to the private sector, because they're simply the inverse of each other. Essentially, these balances have to add up if you add the foreign sector as well. And the basic argument I've made is that in the countries which are in this post-bubble situation, collapsing housing prices, collapsing credit systems which have just been rescued, the private sector has cut spending relative to income dramatically. The swings are completely enormous in the last 3 years, from 10 percentage points of GDP up, in the case of Spain and Ireland, to 17% of GDP. And the fiscal deficits are simply the other side of the coin. They're the consequence of what's happened in the private sector. So if we're going to get the fiscal balances in order, we need a really strong private sector recovery. And the question is, how are we going to get that?
Now, investment is down now overall, and saving is up. This, of course, at a time when deficits are widening overall. Where do you see this the most in the world?
Well, as I said, the big swings here have been in the countries like the US, the UK, Spain, Ireland, which had these huge property bubbles and the credit extension with it. And essentially, it's completely rational. When the bubbles burst, the private sector cut back. Then it affected corporations. They've cut their investment as well. And there have been these huge swings in the financial surpluses, in the surpluses of the private sector. That's then created big recession conditions. And that's driven these government deficits. What worries me is if the governments start to close their deficits without... There's no crowding out, in my view, here. The government is being crowded in. So if the government starts slashing its spending and raising taxes, that will just push the recession back into a depression. It won't help anything at all.
A bit of a catch-22 there. Do you see any countries that have achieved a balance of private spending and external balances?
Yes, the most balanced are the ones that started off in surplus, like Germany, because they had a large surplus in the private sector at the beginning, and they've been able to sustain that largely. The government has offset the decline in the external balance. But everybody can't do that. The problem is, if we're in a world with some countries which have very large external surpluses, others have to have deficits. And if they're going to have these deficits, then domestic spenders have to spending has to exceed income. What really worries me is the only way we get out of this is we generate more bubbles, either in these old countries that used to have the bubbles, we start all over again, or in the rest of the world. It's the real problem is not the public sector. The real problem is what's been going on in the private sector.
All right, we thank you for your thoughts. I've been speaking with Martin Wolf. He's the chief economic commentator at the Financial Times in London.